I'm Ella Bruggink. Please, hazard a guess as to what this map represents. This is a map showing where presidential and national parliamentary elections are held this year, 2024. Now, considering our theme tonight is becoming adults in a changing world, what a better contextual backdrop. I mean, in the countries in which I've grown up, we officially become adults at 18, which means I associate adulthood with gaining the power to vote, the power to have a say in the direction in which our world is headed. Now that, in conjunction with my interest for international relations, has meant that I've kept a pretty close eye on how things have unfolded this year. And I think we've all felt this increased negativity surrounding politics as a whole. But how has this manifested itself exactly? Well, a 2024 American Psychological Association report highlights a 17% jump in the amount of Americans who view the elections as a significant source of stress in their lives. Another 72% are concerned about election-based violence. And these types of figures make part of a much larger trend. See, the 2024 World Economics Forum Global Risk Reports highlights diminishing trust, increased political polarization, and a volatile geopolitical landscape, and marks these as a significant threat to global cooperation. See, to me, all of these things serve as a signal that we need to make a change as a society, because unattended, political polarization is only going to get worse. And I understand that for some of you in the audience today, political polarization may be hard to picture, but I'm quite sure by the end of my talk, you will have picked out your own personal reasons why not to move towards a world fully marked by it. But here are some things to consider if we'd be moving towards a more politically polarized world. Firstly, societies would go back to being divided along political lines. This means that communities are created which actually only parrot the same views. Think of all the diverse perspectives we'd miss out on hearing. Diverse perspectives we could actually use to enrich our lives. As well, new ideas would be met with increased skepticism because we trust each other less. There would be less cooperation, and in the same way, policies that would get voted upon would struggle to gain a majority, which may place certain countries in legislative gridlock and slow overall progression in our world. As well, political discussions could become less about policy making and, unfortunately, more about personal attacks, and they could even turn into violent attacks. Now, I think that's given you all something to consider, but I know one thing for sure. I just don't want political polarization to worsen, and we're already getting a flavor of this today. But how I suggest we begin to reverse this is by using the news as a tool. How I think that political polarization has started to increase is actually the news we consume, namely the news we see on social media today. Let me explain. News has divided society, but it also has the power to bring us back together. Just depends on our attitudes towards it and how we consume it. News consumption has changed. I think some of you have experienced this change from having to go out on the street in the morning to get a local paper to now having 24/7 access to news from around the world. The issue with this, though, is that we feel like we're constantly surrounded by news, so we have less tendency to go seek it out ourselves. This is what a 2022 Oxford and Reuters study labeled as an increased indirect exposure to news. The issue with said indirect exposure to news is that most of it actually comes from our social media feeds. And I'm sure we've all been told before that we can't rely solely on social media to ensure that we gain a well-balanced view of the world today, let alone leaders' policies. But let me remind you of some of the dangers of the news we see on social media. Look, we're running on this treadmill of constant stimulation with so many things always fighting for our attention. So how social media gets us to stop and actually read their news is that they will title their news with very simple, digestible headlines which are made to evoke really strong emotions, which often means that they're oversimplified. Let me illustrate my point. I'm looking mostly at the younger ones in the audience here today. But how many of you have read a full broadsheet style article and just stopped reading halfway because you felt like you couldn't understand any of the political jargon or economic metrics? Well, trust me, I've been there as well. And it actually makes sense why social media doesn't feel incentivized to provide a well-balanced or nuanced view of the world. It may actually risk boring or diminishing attention spans. So, yes, setting aside 8 whole minutes to read a full news article may feel like a chore, but that just goes to show that we as a society don't understand anymore what the power of the news can do for society as a whole. Because in isolation, these sensationalist headlines may not even be harmful. We may be able to call them out for what they are, an exaggeration, an oversimplification of the truth. Because sometimes we're not told a crucial piece of information, which could totally change our view on something. But the issue is that the algorithm already sees that we've engaged with said one-sided post and will keep feeding us posts of the same nature. And it's in this echo chamber that we become susceptible to passively accepting what we read to be the full and complete truth, when it often isn't. And the danger is this echo chamber effect can extend into real life. This news, it evokes strong emotion, and we're more likely to share this emotionally charged and divisive content with our friends, which means that certain false views can be confirmed back to us in real-life conversations with our friends. Now, this echo chamber effect is a major characteristic of an increasingly polarized world. But how I like to see it is that by being polarized, and by passively consuming news rather than actively going to seek it out, we're actually limiting ourselves. Only with a complete picture of the world today can we actually best go about pushing forward change, which is meaningful to us. But luckily, we can begin to reverse this political polarization and negativity surrounding politics. By sparking curiosity in others, we can also help our peers out of the echo chamber. All we need to do is spread the idea of using the news as a tool. Now, here are some actionable steps you can use to begin to use the news as a tool. 1, make politically savvy news choices. Next time you're scrolling on Instagram and you happen to stumble upon the BBC's news story, use that as a reminder, swipe out, and go read a full news article instead. Perhaps, like me, you'll come to realize that society isn't under collapse like some of these really extreme, outrageous headlines we see on social media may lead us to believe. Although simple, I think it's actually a great first step to ameliorating social cohesion. By getting rid of misunderstanding and misinformation, we may see less violent protests and clashes within society. 2, diversify your news sources. Don't always revert back to the same news source. For those of us who will still have the luxury to vote someday, we will be able to keep our democracies effective. We will be casting a well-informed vote which will contribute towards a more positive world, one with less anxiety around politics because we have increased trust in one another and the information that we hold. Lastly, I implore you all to make news consumption a sustainable habit. Now, a way that I've incorporated news consumption into my daily life to ensure that it never feels like a chore is when I'm on the go and I find myself putting my AirPods in, sometimes instead of playing music, I'll just play an international affairs podcast. Now, together, using these steps, let's break free from the algorithm and the echo chamber. And let's let the news that we search for empower us as we move forward in this changing world. Put simply, as we become adults in this changing world, let's use the news as a tool. Thank you.